Welcome to Cafe Europa Online. It's a programme of the Hampshire European Movement to provide a point of contact for those of us who remain committed Europeans and to provide information on topical subjects. Tonight's talk will be recorded and will be available from our YouTube channel, where you'll also find previous talks. If you enjoy tonight's talk and you're not on our mailing list, you can sign up on our website, hands4eu.org, to be notified about future talks. You can also find other useful links there. I'll put the links into the chat. So we're going to have various people saying a short piece at the outset as a panel discussion. Please put your questions into the chat as we go along, and I will invite people then to ask their question. If you don't see a chat icon on your menu bar, you may need to hit more. So tonight we're addressing the subject of twinning for rebuilding European connections, and wanted to briefly bring Martin Todd, who many of you will know is a local councillor, to say something briefly in case he gets hoiked away very quickly. So with that, I will pass the spotlight over to you, Martin.
Thank you very much indeed, and I'm really pleased that this is happening. And it came out of a conversation that something that had been bothering me about the Europe campaign, and a conversation that William and I had been having. And one of the things that was a big problem in the European campaign was that we lost the emotional argument and tried to win back with a rational argument, but we were losing on emotion. And I was thinking about actually my grandfather, who was a stalwart of the Conservative Party, sadly. Well, at least one of them was, the other one wasn't. But also a passionate pro-European, had fought in the Second World War and was very active in kind of twinning. And for a long time before Britain joined on this, you know, there'll be people who have more direct experience of this than I do, but before Britain joined the EU, there was a whole programme, an emotional programme, which was about removing barriers, ending the othering of people in Europe, and reconnecting and realising that we had to know people as people, and that end the othering that we've seen very strongly as part of the whole European discussion, particularly from Brexiteers. And so we got onto the subject of twinning, because when you look at twinning through that lens, you can see how it was actually an important part of the journey that the country took that led towards it, joining the emotional journey, the fact that people were going to each other's schools, that there were exchanges, that there were people getting to know each other as human beings, which seemed to be a bigger thing in the past and seemed to be something that had sort of lost its way, in which we were taking for granted. And so I thought it'd be really useful to have a discussion about twinning, to say, is it something that we should be reinvigorating as a social project, but also as a political project, as part of saying, we are not going to win this with facts alone. We will win this through relationships. And can twinning be a contributor to that? So that was the start of the conversation, and I'd really like to thank William for taking that conversation and making something more positive and practical and interesting with people, experts from, you know, the local area and experts in the topic, to take that further, or maybe ignore it completely and talk about other things that we need to think about in the context of twinning.
Okay. Well, thank you for being our warm-up act, Martin. If I can move on to introduce our main guest speaker tonight. So she trying to get to the start. Yeah, so our first speaker tonight joined the Department of Geography and Earth Science at the University of Aberystwyth in 2018. She's held previous appointments at the University of Melbourne, including as Research Fellow with the NHMRC Cognitive Decline Partnership Centre. As a founding member of Melbourne's Art Curriculum Design Lab, she worked to bring real-world challenges into university classrooms. She gained her PhD from the University of Melbourne in 2014, winning the Australian Anthropological Society's Best Thesis Prize. Originally from Aotearoa, New Zealand, she completed her BA, BCom and MA Hons at the University of Auckland. Please welcome Dr Bryonny Goodwin-Hawkins.
Thank you, and thank you everyone. I hope I can add a little to what Martin has started us off with to fill us in. And I think I want to cover 3 key points. Now, apologies first of all for my lighting. If I put the light on above me, I have a very strange halo, so I've got the side light instead. But I want to cover 3 points this evening, and please start waving at me if I do the academic thing and waffle on too much, but I will try not to. So I want to look a little bit at the story of town twinning, where it came from, and Martin's already suggested a little bit about that. I want to mention how I became involved in it as a researcher, and then to look at some of the findings that my colleague Rhys Davies-Jones and I have found from the research that we've been doing around Welsh and Breton twinning. And I think from the conversation that was already happening before we started, that may resonate with you a little bit. Okay, so the story of where town twinning came from. It is older than the Second World War, so it does have roots before that. We think the first twinning in the UK was in Keighley in West Yorkshire. But it really grew after the Second World War for obvious reasons, a lot around peace building, a lot of it actually led by Germany, by German towns who wanted to reach out and find new ways to reconnect. And there was this sort of sense of being in many ways a municipal olive branch, if you like. And we can understand that a little bit as almost a civil society parallel to the political developments that would later become the EU. Okay, so this was saying that ordinary people could be part of this coming together and forming these relationships. Now, if we jump ahead to the late 60s, early 70s, and Britain's preparation to enter what was then the EEC, around that time there was, and I cannot tell you exactly when this started, there was what was then known as the RIPON program. And that was a part of the preparation process, and it was to improve cultural relations between the UK and Europe. And not a large amount, but a certain amount of money from that went to twinning. And we actually saw a doubling of twinning in the UK at that time as a result of that. One thing to slightly remember is, of course, at the time then, it was also the Cold War. So there was a real emphasis as well on who our friends were. And that's why we generally tend to see a lot of the older twinnings tend to be with Western Europe, because that was what was emphasized at the time. But the third chapter, which takes us to much more recent decades, has really expanded that. And if you drive around, you will see now that on welcome signs, flags for all sorts of different places. Those expansions, a lot of them have really come up around a sense of international solidarity and ways for citizens to get involved with that. Some of the early twinning that was developed around that was South African townships at the time to protest apartheid, and a form of solidarity around that. My own town, Mahantles, we have a twin in Tanzania, and that's developed around a local honey factory that's been involved in importing honey from African countries for quite some time, and has built development connections around that. So taking up to the present, there is a real story of civil society and making connections and how people come together across borders and with one another. However, in recent times, we have got the new verb, which is untwinning, and I'll come to that a little bit more later, but you may already have come across a bit of untwinning. Now, in terms of how I became involved in town twinning or research on it, and I add that I'm not a member of an association, but I do a lot of research around it, is last year I was working on a European project, a Horizon 2020 funded project, and we were looking in different European countries around stories about migration. And here in the UK, we wanted to tell some stories about migration that were less well known. So a lot of what we hear about European migration in the UK tends to tell us about particular groups, like Polish people, or particular places, mostly London. And we wanted to look at some of the hidden stories around that. So we started doing a little project around the Germans of Wales. Now, if you're from Germany, you certainly don't move to Wales as an economic migrant. And if you want to move in the countryside, you have quite a lot of nice countryside where it doesn't rain all the time. So we wanted to understand, why would Germans be moving to Wales? And one of the things that we were really interested to find is that the majority had some kind of cultural or educational exchange experience. And through that, they'd made local connections, they'd started feeling embedded in Wales, and they'd started to feel that this was a place that they would like to come back to and live. And we have also found some French town twinning connections around that as well. So following on from understanding those cultural connections, I wanted to understand, well, what are the organizations that form these connections? So I started getting into looking at town twinning from there. And we particularly started looking at Welsh and Breton connections. They developed really around the 70s, although the first was Cardiff and Nantes in 1964. Now, Breton people will tell you that Nantes is in Brittany. Officially it's not, but we'll count it. But have since grown up through the 70s and 80s, and we've now got over 40 Welsh and Breton connections, town twinning connections in Wales, which really celebrate the Celtic connections quite a lot. So I did some research and I went over to Brittany and spent time with twinning associations there to look at what their relationships are, whether they have some of the same issues that we do here in the UK. And just as a sort of third point, I'll take you through a little bit some of the challenges and opportunities that we found through that. So the first is we found a number of reasons why people want to get involved with town twinning. The first one is meeting new people. That's a big one, and that includes at home. And there were a lot of people, particularly in France, who moved to a new town and joined the Town Twinning Association as a way to meet people. So it's about meeting people both at home and abroad. The second one is learning languages, fairly obviously, and related to that, an interest in finding out about other countries and cultures. The fourth one is organised tours, and we have had, particularly in Wales, some people say that one thing they really value about town twinning is the opportunity to be able to travel abroad with pre-arranged contacts, but also it's sometimes cheaper. So it's something that they can access that maybe they couldn't normally. Maintaining memories and connections was also quite important for a lot of people. So people may have travelled to France or to Wales in the past, and they would now like to keep up with that. They have good memories, they would like to keep that connection. And the last one that I mentioned is we have a lot of parents whose children went on exchanges. Sometimes that was 20 or 30 years ago, but they got quite involved and they've stayed involved. Interestingly enough, and you may have different experiences in Hampshire, but in Wales and in Brittany, there seems to be less interest in the children who went on exchanges themselves staying involved. They'll usually keep up connections with the families, but not necessarily with the twinning itself. So we tend to see the parents rather. And that brings me to the challenges. Now, one of the big ones is that most twinning associations tell us that they're struggling to attract younger members. Partly that is because we're seeing declining European language enrolments in schools, both in Wales and across the UK. At the same time, there is another challenge which is around safeguarding, which has made it harder to be able to run the classic school exchanges, because you can no longer simply put young people up in families' houses without safeguarding checks. More broadly, there are challenges around administration. We have seen particular issues for councils under austerity have struggled with their budgets. They've often cut cultural sector. Town twinning has, in many cases, been affected by that. That's also been slightly amplified by a growing Euroscepticism and sometimes accusations that town twinning is a council-funded junket and it's just people going off on holiday on the council. And then more strategically within associations, we've seen worries about ageing leadership and not having people who've got the time or the energy who can sort of carry on the baton, as it were. And a lot of the people in associations that I've worked with are actually quite early. They may have been involved with twinning right back to the 70s, and they're still there as the president doing all that great leadership work, but getting to the point where they want to say, who else can do this so I can put my feet up for a bit? And that's been a big challenge when there aren't those young people there. Okay, so that's a general short tour. But to wrap up, I want to think a little bit about where we might be going. Now, the first thing is that I think that town twinning's past should give us heart. It has always been there to make those connections, to make connections that are slow and meaningful. And it's been there at points of pressure or concern. So it was there after the war, it was there around integrating into the EU. And I think that we're obviously experiencing points of pressure now, both with Brexit and COVID-19. And perhaps we can find new ways to make those connections across borders. I would like to think that we can do it with that spirit of solidarity that town twinning has always had. And I would like to think as well that as we reimagine our tourism habits, as I think we're already learning, we might come back to this idea of travel that is slower and more meaningful, and not just where your cheapest EasyJet ticket can get you, but where you can meet people who want to engage with you. I think there are real benefits within there. But I don't want to be overconfident because those challenges are quite significant. I think the future of town twinning is not going to look like its past. Certainly at the moment, the situation with school exchanges, they're not looking like they're coming back. New generations do association in different ways and are not interested in getting involved with associations in the same ways. And there is always a risk, and I did some of my earlier research I did around closing Methodist chapels in Yorkshire with very small congregations. And we know sociologically that organisations that get stuck on their reproduction are often unable to imagine the transformation that they actually need. So they don't need to try to make themselves looking the same. They need to find new ways to move forward, and that's really difficult. So last points, and then I'll stop. Town twinning has come in waves. I think we could be time for a fourth wave of that, but I want to leave it with an open question, which perhaps you'll pick up, is what would town twinning for Generation 2020 look like? So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Bryony. That's very interesting to. I think that last question was the one we were hoping you were going to answer, but maybe that comes later. Okay, so I see from the chat that quite a few people representing quite a few different twinning organisations are on the call, and thank you for identifying yourselves. I'm going to call on Phil Waterton from Winchester to come up first, because he was the one that we discussed this with in advance. But if those of you who have volunteered yourselves in the chat would like to have a think about what you might like to say in a few minutes about your own twinning organisation, then we can work through people in turn before we sort of have a wider discussion. So with that, over to you, Phil.
Okay, thanks, William. I haven't actually prepared anything particularly exciting for this evening. I just sort of come along and give you really some thoughts on the experience that we've had in Winchester. Winchester Lawn Twinning Association was founded about 25 years ago now, following a relatively unsuccessful, I think, twinning in the past with Versailles. I'm not quite sure why that folded. When I joined, probably 15 years ago, it was quite active. We had quite a lot of middle-aged, you know, still working people, working age members, probably about 50, 60 people. Over the years, that membership has declined. People have moved away. We're having great trouble getting committee members. As has already been mentioned, we're having difficulty getting younger people involved. We have tried, with great help of Winchester City Council and the Mayor, and the various mayors in Winchester have been very supportive and done their very best to try and help us out. And we did try to reach out to schools a few years ago to see if any schools would be interested in forming their own exchanges and then becoming part of our larger association. Unfortunately, we did have the safeguarding issue came up, as one would expect, plus the fact that some schools had already established relationships with other towns elsewhere in France. So it was very difficult to get the kids involved. And we're in the situation now where, in order to survive, we have no ideas other than try and join forces with other organisations in or around Winchester. Not quite sure why this is happening. There appear to be some relatively successful twinning associations of villages around Winchester. I think New Alresford, or Alresford generally, have a successful association. And it's possibly due to the fact it's a smaller community with less going on. And people are willing to sort of do things other than just the annual trip to France or the annual visit from the French to us, and have more time to get involved with other things. I know other boroughs around the area. I think North Baddesley have a successful association, and I know I'm aware of the association in Romsey, although I don't know anything about it, I'm afraid. But I'm really just speaking for Winchester. We're a little bit disheartened. We get the impression that people don't want to go and stay with families and you know, use people's toilets with funny plumbing and eat strange food, and it's just a bit of a shame. I find it very sad, because personally I participated in 2 school exchanges back in the 60s when I lived in Hertfordshire. Very successful. I'm still very friendly with the families I stayed with now. Since I joined Winchester Lawn Twinning Association, I've made very good friends, and I know a lot of the people there, and I make private personal visits to my friends and they come and stay with me. But we just lost the community spirit, I think, which is a bit of a shame. And I don't really know quite what to do about it. I'm hoping that some of you guys might come up with some ideas and suggestions.
Okay, thank you for that. Interesting sort of view of where things are, and probably the youngest group that we have in terms of how long it's been running of any of the ones. Several of the other people who've posted have talked about their quite long-standing status, which I imagine must mean that they've dealt with succession during that time. But the first person to put their hand up metaphorically was Martin from Cheltenham. So do you want to say something about your experiences, Martin?
Yeah, well, I've been a member of Cheltenham Twinning Association since it was formed nearly 20 years ago. But that was on the back of an organisation called Cheltenham Twinning Forum, which was really a kind of an informal subcommittee of the Borough Council, because the Borough Council, invested heavily in twinning over a number of years. But by this point, I think they were beginning to feel that it should be, in a sense, outsourced a bit, and they felt that a voluntary organisation would have greater capacity to raise funds and stimulate more local activity. I mean, that's been only partly successful, I have to say. Part of our twinning structure is that the association has an executive committee. 3 of those members, and there has to be, I think, a minimum of 8 members. 3 of those members have to be borough councillors. So there is a close political affiliation, which I think is really very important, because at different points, and Bryony will understand this, I'm sure, as much as anyone else, and our other politician friend here, that you do need at different times political support, because the slender budget that exists for twinning is always ripe to be plucked by cash-strapped councils. We were under threat about 8 years ago, very strongly, but we managed to resist that. And that's partly because we still pay in Cheltenham Borough for a twinning officer, a part-time twinning officer. She's called Annette. She's been in the job for over 30 years. So she has an incredible amount of knowledge and contacts and expertise in dealing with the 5 different twin towns we have. Actually, we have 2 friendship towns as well, one in Kisumu, Kenya, and a tiny community in Holland called Stampersgat, which was a village that was liberated by Gloucestershire Regiment soldiers at the end of the Second World War. So they were very keen to keep a connection going. But anyway, the important thing is, from our point of view, is that the Borough Council still invest sufficient money to pay a half-time twinning officer. And then the other things that happen around are so dependent on the individual enthusiasms to keep things going by different people. The youth stuff is a problem. I was a professional youth worker for over 30 years, and I know how difficult it is to motivate kids. But what I do know is that once you do motivate them and they go on these and have these experiences abroad, they are almost transformed, especially the kind of kids I was working with from relatively disadvantaged backgrounds. Giving them this taste of being abroad, integrating with kids from other countries was really quite liberating for them. And one thing I'd like to add to what Bryony said, I mean, obviously the EU impact, leaving the EU impact, we are still not sure how that's going to really affect us. But the big worry is to do with Erasmus and what's going to happen, not just with students, because obviously Erasmus itself was just a student program, but 2 years ago it pulled in the other funding streams, including what was called Youth in Action, which was for informal youth organisations to be able to go and participate in exchanges, very generously funded. We were able to involve kids who otherwise would just not get the chance. And like, as you've mentioned, in Cheltenham, schools have backed off from taking part in exchanges. We used to have a regular Annecy in France exchange program with our local schools. We had a big program with Göttingen schools as well. They have all gone. They have all gone. And I see no likelihood of them being resurrected. So that's a big issue. Currently, we are very engaged with Russia. Sochi's been our twin town for 60 years. I organised the first ever youth exchanges with that in the early 1990s after the Berlin Wall came down. We then hit a big lull. For the past 10 years, very little happened. But we are now picking up on a lot of new things with Sochi. I was there in November. There's a big Sochi Film Festival that we're working with to come to Cheltenham next year. So, good things happen and bad things happen. It's just being able to work out what's going to happen as a result of the EU is the big issue. And finally, at least in Cheltenham now, we have a borough council which is strongly in favour of twinning in a way that just has not been the case in the last 20 or 30 years. It's been a fairly grudging acceptance by some, and sometimes a majority of local councillors. The political complexion of our council now is such that they are very favourably inclined towards the EU and towards twinning as a concept generally. I've spoken too much, I'll stop there.
That's great, thank you very much. Yeah, it's very interesting what you're saying about the role of local councillors, and we have at least one other current local councillor and one or two, I think, former ones who may have something to contribute on that in due course. And I noted Patrick said he's happy to talk about his, but sort of working through in sequence. Perhaps I can call on Andrew from Portsmouth to say something.
Okay.
If you'd like to.
Yes. I don't quite know what I'm supposed to do. Ah, here we go. I'm on now, am I? I'm live.
Yeah. You have the spotlight.
Okay. Yes, I'm the chair of Portsmouth and Caen and Duisburg Twinning Association. There weren't many people interested in the German association, so we merged the two together and we formed one called the ECTC, the European Cities Twinning Committee. In 2018, we tried starting relaunches, and we launched a Friends of Portsmouth Twinning in January of this year, and we're all set to have an event every single month and invite lots of locals and have a big song and dance made. And we did one in February, and that was it. And then the COVID came and put the kibosh on everything. So we were looking to do a relaunch, and we got members of our Portsmouth Friends Twinning Association coming along. Quite a few, the majority retired age, and yes, not too many young people, but we've been working on ideas, and we'd reached out to quite a few local twinning associations and regional ones as a result of the Bristol conference that happened last September that we went to. And we were looking to sort of get more people involved and work with the local twinning associations and try and come up with some ideas, maybe do some things on this side to promote twinning and the fact it exists, and people might be interested in contacting their local town or city or whichever one it is that they have. That's what our ideas were. And I only came across your meeting on Facebook this afternoon, otherwise I wouldn't be here. Thought it might be interesting to come along and see what you were discussing and put the word out that we are looking to do things. One of the things that was mentioned when we left the EU was that people who were interested in retaining something European should reach out to their local twinning association and sign up and join and see what they can do about getting more contact with the European cities that they are linked with and their cities are linked with. Portsmouth has 2 in Europe. The rest of our sister cities and link cities are all over the world. We have about 12 in total. One of the things we do is have a presence at events in Portsmouth. So the Kite Festival, which would have been on this month, we would have had a stand there. We would have been at Victorious with the Portsmouth ambassadors. We work with them. It's a group of people in the city who promote the city to tourists and people within the city itself. We're also working with the Portsmouth Society and a few, reaching out and showing that we exist and we can do things and get things going. They're very keen in Caen on doing things, and Duisburg is sort of keen on doing things, but they're that little bit further away. Caen is very easy. We have a ferry that takes us directly from Portsmouth to Caen. So we are looking at doing things, but like everybody says, I'm about the youngest person in the association. So we need to get some more young people involved. Schools, having worked as a teacher in schools for many years, won't do exchanges anymore. They can't do exchanges without actually legally going in and checking that they're going to be sending kids to a safe family. But we worked on doing virtual exchanges, video conferencing as it was called back then, sending the old-fashioned letters, which kids don't do anymore from class to class. The main problem is that lots of schools teach Spanish, and we don't have a Spanish twin town. Many places don't. That's about all I can say off the top of my head.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. It's interesting. You seem to have quite an active association going on in Portsmouth. There's several factors that sort of maybe point towards that, one of which is that you seem to sort of amalgamated into one organisation rather than having separate country organisations.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if the actual sheer size of Portsmouth works in its favour, although what Phil was saying before, he was wondering whether Alresford is more successful because it's smaller. So yes, interesting viewpoints on that. David, do you want to say something next about what you were doing in Eastleigh?
Myself, yeah, I will do. I mean, I was the chair. Well, I was actively involved and the chair of Eastleigh Twinning Association for a number of years in the late 1980s, and we were twinned and still are twinned with Conveston, which is just outside Stuttgart, and Villeneuve-Saint-Georges on the outskirts of Paris. I think the thing that made it successful there were personalities, but I think one of the most important things was it was at that time very well supported by the local council, particularly people like the late Margaret Curl, who ensured that there was admin support provided by often from the mayor's office. It had a lot of different types of links. There were music links, there were sporting links, football and tennis. The churches had a link. There was even a carnival link. And I know that that as a result of these different meetings that took place, that lots of friendships built up, and indeed I know from person that I know of someone where it actually even led to a marriage. So there were lots of things, but I think the critical thing was the support of the council, both in terms of hosting events and providing some sort of financial support and admin support. And my impression is that in the 1990s, when I ceased to be involved, as I was working away from Eastleigh and working in London, that interest from the local council deteriorated, and my impression is that there's not much happening now. In a way it's rather sad, because when I was involved, there were probably a large number of people, both young and old, involved, and now it's to a very large extent seems to have disappeared, and it's rather sad, I think.
Somebody seems to have a dog going in the background.
Not my dog.
Thank you for that.
But I think this link with the local, with the support both in tangible and intangibles from the council is absolutely critical. Unfortunately, I think despite the political persuasion of the current council in Eastleigh, they don't seem to show much enthusiasm for twinning activities.
Okay. Thanks. I was going to ask Roland if you wanted to say a bit next. You seem to have a slight local management issue going on.
Well, I think it was probably a dog, which is a neighbour's dog, actually. You'll probably hear it. Sorry about that. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm chairman of Romsey Twinning. We have 3 twin towns in Europe. The oldest dating back to 1960, and we should be, in 2 weeks' time, we should be over there in Paimpol on the North Brittany coast, celebrating that 60th anniversary. Sadly, obviously not happening now. And then subsequently with town in Germany called Battenberg, which, well, those of you may know that Romsey, Broadlands, Mountbatten connection, that's why Battenberg happened. And most recently, only 6 years ago, with a town near Milan called Treviglio. First, I've already said hello on chat to Andrew, and I just want to thank him again for the initiative that Portsmouth took in January. Andrew's referred to that, of bringing people together. That was a really good meeting. Thank you. I'm just so sorry that developments have temporarily been halted and scuppered by you know what. But I hope we can sort of resurrect that in due course. I'm sure Andrew wants to. I think just two particular points I want to make. One is I'll go with this one first. I think this is in a way a question for Bryonny. As I'm sure anyone who knows about twinning is aware, and I hope Bryonny's not going to correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think so. There has never been, unlike a lot of other, community organizations or networks in this country, twinning has never had a national representative body. Now, I see that seems to me is both a strength and a weakness. The strength is that twinning has evolved sort of from the bottom up, responding to grassroots conditions and circumstances. It was able to, when it was in its heyday, be very responsive to local circumstances, local context, views, and so on. And that's a good thing. The weakness is that when our backs have been to the wall, as they have been certainly in the last, I'd say, 20 years probably, it's been much.
Hello, Andy. Twinning to reconnect with the EU.
What? Have you still got me? Yeah. I don't know what that was. I lost my train of thought. Yes, in a more hostile environment, we've had no one at national government level speaking up for twinning. And I've really felt the lack of that. I don't know what other people think. I mean, in these days of lobbying for influence and power and so on, we've had no one at Westminster doing this on behalf of the twinning movement. And I think that's a pity. I'd be sort of particularly interested to hear any thoughts that Bryonny has about that. The second point is, and I suspect I'm not alone in feeling this, I feel a massive ambivalence towards the internet and towards social media and the way in which we're communicating now. On the one hand, it's been particularly, and of course it's been highlighted by the pandemic, because at least we're able to have this discussion now through the internet and Zoom and so on, and that's brilliant. And for many of us, it's been a lifeline in being able to keep in touch with our friends on the continent and overseas, wherever it is. We can use it. At the same time, I'll stick my neck out here, and I don't know whether anyone's going to agree with me. For me, virtual twinning is just that. It is virtual twinning. It is not twinning. It is not the real thing. And it never will be. And I don't think it ever can be. Because I think the whole thing about twinning is, well, to say nothing else, I mean, two of the senses involved cannot so far be replicated on the internet. You can't smell, you can't taste stuff online. And those are key things. I mean, we all have memories of when we were young people of going to a foreign country and it all feeling very foreign and alien and sometimes a bit scary. I certainly remember that, and smells and tastes were a key element in all that. Online, you miss all that. And those are experiences that, are very special and our young people are not getting, even though they're more connected than we could ever dream of having been when we were their age. So I don't know. I really don't know. A good thing or a bad thing. I mean, obviously, I think it can be harnessed to our ends, but I'm not quite sure why. What I'd be particularly interested in hearing from other people is, do they think that virtual twinning can be subsumed into twinning and made to work for us, or are they actually going in slightly different directions? Our model of face-to-face real twinning and virtual twinning. And I think, obviously the pandemic has really put the spotlight on that, hasn't it? So it's good. We need to have those discussions, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Roland. And Patrick, if I can pass the spotlight to you briefly.
Yeah, thank you, William. Just one or two observations, really. My involvement has been very limited, but I've observed twinning over a long, long time. I worked for Eastleigh for 30 odd years, Eastleigh Council, and really echoing what David was saying, the council in those days was very enthusiastic in supporting twinning in a fairly limited way, but the great advantage was an enthusiastic retired teacher, some may remember Gordon Cox, who effectively ran twinning in Eastleigh for generations. And I think that is the key to this. If it's going to really flourish, you need an enthusiast or a group of enthusiasts who are willing to do it. But it also needs a wider involvement of people. Now, it may well be, my recollections are so long ago, that the whole world has changed it's turned upside down. And perhaps we ought to be looking at it in a very different way. I personally went to Villeneuve, Saint-Georges as part of a visit once, paid our own going there, but it was interesting. Again, as far as Winchester's concerned, I once went to Gießen under my own steam because I happened to be in Germany, thought it'd be interesting to see it as a twin town. The other wider thing, and I wonder sometimes whether this sort of twinning is still appropriate. Even longer ago, 40 odd years ago, I went as part of a Europa Nostra trip round Germany, which was, again, my recollection is I paid my own airfare to Frankfurt, and everything else was then provided. I remember eating asparagus twice a day for a week, which is because it was the asparagus season. But anyway, it was an organisation, cultural, historic, that was linked to particular towns. So lots of other English, Scottish, Welsh towns were involved, and people were representing them in that country for a particular purpose. It's a sort of twinning, but it seems a wider issue than this very localised twinning. And I have grave reservations in a way about getting it all going again locally. As has been said, I know some of the parishes, I remember a few years ago, it may still be very active and flourishing. Colden Common had twinning with a town in Normandy, and it may well still function. But I think the only other general point I want to make is how little, even those of us who are involved locally, have any idea what's going on in twinning or any of these related activities. The local authorities, certainly in my observation, give no publicity to it at all. It's left to a group of volunteers, and we've touched already on the difficulty now with getting youngsters involved on school trips or sporting trips or whatever else. And I've really just got a big question mark as to whether the whole thing is worthwhile or not. I mean, I'd like to think it is, but I just wonder if there's something better that we ought to come up with. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick. And thanks for all the contributions. There seems to be some interesting threads coming out there that going forward, twinning associations have to manage without two of the major pillars that they were really built up on, one being local authority support and the other being school involvement, and those don't seem like things that can be that readily turned back on. And you mentioned Gordon Cox, and I think every voluntary organisation needs larger than life charismatic characters like him. He was still, I believe, going on twinning visits into his 90s as a retired language teacher because they needed somebody to do the translation and they couldn't possibly manage without him. Bless him. He lived a very long and active life. So at that point, perhaps I can ask Bryonny to sort of come back with any initial thoughts and reactions on things we were saying and before we go into the question and answers. There was one other thing I'd noted down. I was going to raise the issue of whether amalgamations are helpful in going forward, whether they're local or regional, and how the strength of those works against, on the other side, having the local identity. Sorry, Eleanor, did you want to come in with something?
Well, I did put myself on the chat, and it
I'm
was
sorry,
before Patrick.
I didn't see that. I'm very
and
sorry.
In fact, I wanted to come in if possible after Phil, but never mind. I just wanted to put the perspective of, well, certainly with my last year, because as mayor, I was trying to do my best for our twinning in Winchester. The difficulty we have in a district, William, you mentioned that Portsmouth, has the advantage of size. I think it's the fact of having, it's a city and they know who their constituents are. In Winchester, there are many across the district. We know there are many other smaller twinning associations. Colton Common is with Saint-Vigor, Alsford with Briquebec, and various other places. And therefore it's quite difficult to get Winchester District Council to vote time and money to a Winchester Town or Winchester City organisation. And I had actually lined up Town Forum in March to talk about this and see whether we could get some support from the Town Forum because it would be more relevant for Winchester. And sadly, COVID scuppered that. But it was just to make a few points. School exchanges have always gone ahead with the enthusiasm and intimate knowledge of different language teachers. Now, my children, when they were at King's School doing German, they went to Gießen, and that's wonderful. That happened to be the twin town for Winchester. But when I was running language exchanges myself for my students, I took them to Rouen because that was where I had last spent a lot of time and knew best. And I think you'll find that in most schools, when there is a successful school exchange, and I know it's more difficult now, but when there is or was a successful school exchange, it was the particular enthusiasm and knowledge of the individual teachers and languages and where they had their experience. And I think to try and fit that or force it into the particular twinning just won't happen. So I think the twinning associations need to really think about it as cultural associations for the city, for the town, adult. If they can involve the young people at the same time, great. But don't try and force it onto the schools and the school exchanges or even the colleges and so on, the universities at the same time. The other thing I was going to say was that, for example, Gießen, I didn't have a formal activity with the Gießen Twinning Association last year as mayor, but there were two very, very enthusiastic and successful events that were spin-offs, if you like. There was a choir visit from Gießen to Winchester, and they were hosted over a weekend, all entirely voluntary and funded by the choir this end and so on. And the mayor of Gießen happened to be in the choir, so she came and we had various exchanges and so on. It was very good, but it wasn't a twinning exchange, it was the choir doing it. And then of course the run that goes from Winchester to Gießen and then from Gießen to Winchester the next year. That's really, I think, well, it's running enthusiasts. I don't know whether it's an athletic club, but it's, again, it's not specifically a twinning association, but those towns and those people have managed to keep that interest alive and do activities that are meaningful for them. So I think we just have to embrace that and be thankful, if you like, that those activities are going ahead and that they are meaningful. Phil mentioned Winchester and Versailles. As far as I know, well, certainly it was there in, I mean, I was a member of Winchester Long Twinning Association in the 80s, so it's at least 30 plus, nearly 40 years old with Long. Before that, it was with Versailles, who wanted Windsor. That's why they didn't want Winchester. They didn't really understand and appreciate our wonderful ancient capital history. They wanted Windsor, and they got it. So as far as I know, Versailles is now twinned with Windsor, and sort of good luck to them on that score. And we then, as I understand it, looked around for an ancient capital, and Long which is quite difficult to get to, unfortunately, and is very little known here or anywhere else in England, is an ancient capital of one of the northeastern states, in the early years before France became unified. So it's a lovely place to go, but it's a longer journey than it is for Portsmouth, Caen or Southampton, who are very lucky to have very easy, quick links to their opposite numbers the other side of the channel. So it's a little bit of a sort of hit and miss, this thing. And I think we should just be as supportive as we can. I know that Winchester City Council or District Council certainly doesn't give any funding. And I'm not sure that I don't know if it would. Winchester Town Forum possibly might. I didn't get a chance to pursue that one in March and April and May. But I think we have to understand that there is, unfortunately, a deep-rooted sense. Your first speaker mentioned the council junket. Yeah, as far as I know, nobody's ever gone on a junket because they don't get paid for anything. Everything is paid for by themselves, or they're hosted free by a family and so on. So the idea of junkets from our side is a total nonsense. Whereas when you receive people from your twin towns and cities from abroad, they may well come with funding and support from their local council. But on the whole, we don't. And so it's one of those wonderful skeptic things. Oh, we're not getting in on that. It's just a junket. It's a jolly. Well, as far as I know, I've certainly never been in receipt of any funding on that score. But I do think we ought. The other thing to say is that twinning existed before we were members of the EU. Therefore, Brexit, in a sense, has nothing to do with it. We should certainly keep going on exchanges. There's no reason why our students can't continue in Erasmus post-Brexit. It'll need some negotiation, but it should still happen. There were student HE level exchanges before we were in the EU. So all of that should continue. And, I think it's just one of those things that we should just pursue it for, you might say, for the love of it. And if we can, it will thrive.
Thanks, Eleanor. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get Natalie Wilson from Henry Beaufort's school on this time. She was on our panel on the Erasmus programme, and Henry Beaufort do a lot of European exchanges. I suppose the other thing that would have been interesting had we been able to do it is to get more of an input from twinning organisations outside the UK or the non-UK end, because whatever our enthusiasm for connecting with them may be, it also depends on the reciprocal enthusiasm. But if I can pass back to Bryonny now, having sorry queued you up a few minutes ago, and do you want to sort of comment on what we've talked about so far?
Sure. I liked Eleanor's comment about not a junket, which it certainly isn't. And having spent about 3 days in France following a Welsh mayor around, I can say it was more a case of mild kidnapping than a junket, certainly because he didn't speak French and was spent most of his time being told exactly what to wear, where to stand, and what to say, which I felt a little bit sorry for him sometimes. But I want to come back to 4 points that I think have been raised. The first that came up a little bit in the chat around the level of associations. It seems to me, and maybe this came out a little bit from some of the experiences that were shared, that certainly administratively it's a little bit easier to put twinnings together in more of an umbrella. That was most of what most of our the French associations that I visited, as well as some of the German ones, tend to do, at least the ones I've dealt with. Certainly I know here in Aberystwyth has had a bit of trouble. They had 4 separate associations, and people were saying we don't have the energy to do all of the administration for this, but they didn't want to put them together. So one of them has sort of gone out of business for that. I think maybe coming together could at least share some of the burden or some of the leadership in some ways. The question, was it Roland who asked the question about the nationwide networking? I haven't come across things. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist or hasn't been there. I think someone mentioned that the LGA had been involved. I think there have been periodic attempts to sort of do lists of things. We've seen them in Wales when occasionally someone will get together and go around and figure out where all the twinnings actually are, because they tend to come and go a bit. I actually wonder whether a wider network could be more useful and could be more helpful. There is a wider French and German network which is quite active, that seems to do quite well. But the other reason that I wonder whether it might be quite useful is just to make it easier for people to move around and to make contacts. And perhaps this connects a little bit to what Eleanor mentioned, that people don't necessarily want to, say, take a school exchange to the particular town. They'd like to go somewhere else. Or how can they be networked to get to that town? One of the things that we found in Wales with Germans, we have a lot of Germans, particularly in this area in Mid Wales, and the twinning associations will say, the German twinning associations will say, but they don't join our associations. And if I go and speak to them, they say, but of course not, I have nothing to do with that town, I've never been there, why would I be interested in it? But are there ways in which we can still sort of connect their energy and have more of a relationship to Germany in some way that they could still participate in, but that may not necessarily be to one town, or that could be to a wider network that they could be involved in. What did I write down? I wrote down role, and that made sense when I wrote, oh, right, the role of twinning associations. It was mentioned, and I've seen this as well, is what do they do? And I've seen different approaches to this, and hearing from you, it seems that you have different approaches too. Some are very direct and some are very much around, we have our exchange, we have our annual trip, this is what we do. Others seem to function in perhaps more of a social lubrication role in terms of connecting other groups to each other and organising exchanges for other groups. One thing I did want to ask the people who are involved in twinning organisations, I've been doing a little bit of work lately around YFC, the young farmers clubs in England and Wales, who have a really good succession model by just kicking you out once you're 24. So you have to prepare for people to go up. But they actually run a lot of exchanges. And I wonder whether there are perhaps more opportunities to connect to some of the other organisations that do exchanges, because they're part of Rural Youth Europe, which is quite connected. And the fourth and final point that I want to make is this idea of, I suppose, figureheads and those great energy leaders came up. We have one wonderful man in Germany, in Kronberg, known as Aber Fritz, who has been now has, I think, the freedom of Aberystwyth as well into his 80s, and has been running the Aberystwyth-Kronberg exchange for about 40 plus years. And until you've been on a tour bus with Aber Fritz giving a commentary in German, you haven't lived. And he is wonderful, but he is also at the point of looking for a successor. It is, how do we have the balance of these wonderful people who do establish those relationships and have so much energy, but also making sure that it doesn't fall apart when we don't have them, or if we have someone who wants to have another connection. Now, William mentioned at the start that it would be wonderful if I could answer the question of what will town twinning look like. Alas, I can't do that, but I do hope that it looks like something. And I think perhaps some of the conversations we're having, we can start to figure out how we might make it look.
Thank you, Bryony. Peter, you put a question in the chat. Do you want to put that question yourself now?
Hi, yeah, I will. Bryony kindly answered it in the chat, but I will ask it again, just for everybody's benefit, in case you didn't see it. It was about, I was just wondering whether this was a particularly British symptom of sort of disengagement. So I was asking Bryony whether she had any evidence of, say, for example, Franco-German exchanges or twinnings going into decline as well. Do you want to repeat your answer, Bryony?
I can, yes. Yes, so I think other associations are struggling as well. the associations I've worked with in both France and Germany have many similar problems as we do here in the UK. Specifically, Franco-German twinnings are, a lot of the people would say that, oh, this is the special one. This is the special one because of the history. In France as well, they also told us that it's really annoying getting to Wales, but it's quite easy getting to Germany. So that was also another reason to like those ones. They still have similar problems with decline, but I think there's sometimes more of an impetus to keep them because it's seen as very historically important. You don't want to break up with France or Germany.
Thank you.
Has there been much twinning activity between Wales and Ireland, where potentially they have a language in common, and while being separate countries? But I've not really heard much about people having twinning relationships with Ireland.
A little bit. We do actually have, Aberystwyth has a new one with Ireland because we had the Celtic Challenge, which rose from Wales to Ireland. So that's been a connection that twinning has built on top of. The main Celtic connections really came through Brittany, partly because Breton is actually the closest language to Welsh than Irish Gaelic. And there's a lot of historical connections with saints moving between Wales and Brittany. So when we had a development around Celtic twinning, they tended to go Brittany. That's not necessarily the case from the Breton side, who some of them have shopped around a little bit between Wales and Ireland before they picked where they go, but we don't have as much Ireland as you might think.
Okay, and I think it's Jill had a question in the chat, but I think she actually just left the thing just a moment or two ago. It was saying, again, it was asking the question about any future for virtual twinning, meeting up with other nationalities in a forum like this. I suppose that ties in a bit with what somebody was saying about environmental things as well, that it does cut down on flights, albeit it's a very different kind of relationship, but then connections are so different now compared with 50 years ago. Do you have any sort of thoughts on that, Bryony?
Virtual twinning, I think that is an interesting question, and I can't remember, was it Roland? Who was
Roland was very passionately against it.
Yeah.
Well, it has its place, but it's not twinning, is my point.
Yes, we tried actually when I was designing curriculum at the University of Melbourne. We tried to use an idea of virtual twinning with language students, and it was tricky, to put it lightly. It was tricky to get those connections going. But I mean, I remember being a high school student sort of 20, 30 years ago, and having these sort of pen pal things, which you sort of took over in a burst of enthusiasm for about 3 weeks, and then they sort of ran out. And I don't know whether, in many ways, the internet is very different, but it's also rather the same in some ways. And perhaps we're seeing that with those of us who are becoming zoomed out, that we all rushed to Zoom, and it was very exciting for a few months, and now we're sort of thinking, oh, another Zoom call. I don't know. I think there are certainly opportunities around virtual twinning, but I'll probably lean on Roland's side and say I don't see it as being a long-term substitute.
Okay, well, I think that's covered the key questions that people asked. A few people have sort of said things in the chat as that was sort of at more length. So I have just to sort of open it as a general chat now. Eleanor, do you want to come in?
Sorry, it was talking about the virtual. I think virtual is great once you know and have connected with people. And that's why family chats and everything are very, very good, and maybe with office colleagues. I think to do it cold is exactly that. It's cold. Years ago, we used to run a language prize, a language competition, and one year, this is long before Zoom and all the others, and the prize for the winning team was to go up to IBM and use their video conferencing suite with a school in Spain, and it was as cold and as it could possibly be. It just didn't mean anything to them at all. So I think once you've got a link, once you've been somewhere, you've engaged with people, you can then, it's nice to see them again and you recognize them. If people have shaky language, you're trying to develop it, they need to be with people, they need to see what they're doing, they need to engage, they need to have all the gestures and so on that goes with it. You can't do that on virtual. So virtual is a good stopgap and follow-up, but not a substitute, ever.
Sure. Again, at this stage, sort of happy for just a general open discussion if people want to open their mics, if there's anything else to say. Has anybody picked up any ideas or any sort of steps forward? Is this a way for rebuilding connections in Europe, or is it something that's sort of having more of a legacy role? Roland?
I'd just be interested in other people's views. I mean, I don't know whether it's the elephant in the room, but we haven't specifically talked about the links between, the European movement has a political agenda, of course. And I'm very glad you've hosted this, but twinning is, strictly speaking, the sort of pure twinning is and should be, I think, still apolitical. I mean, it's very hard to maintain that line at the moment, as we all know. But I'd be interested to, and I think you do have to be a bit careful, because if you start introducing, well, anyone who's sort of chairing a twinning association might have a view on this. If you start sort of sailing too close to the political wind, you can risk putting people off, because the point about certainly my membership is I've got people from all ends of the political spectrum, really, pretty much.
As indeed that is very much the position of the European movement as well, that it is a non-partisan thing, and I think that's why many of the people that get involved with it do so. I had hoped that Ian Berridge, who's the chair of the Hampshire European Movement, might be here to potentially take some of these ideas forward, if that is something that has some mileage, but at least you'll be able to listen to the recording.
Interestingly enough, I was able to get 6 or 8 people from our Cheltenham for Europe organisation to take part in their first ever twinning event in Germany last year. So, I mean, for me, it was quite interesting that there they were, passionate Europeans, but they'd never really been involved in twinning before. So that kind of reverses a little bit what was suggested before. And I think because we had such a groundswell of activity in the Cheltenham for Europe setup, which ran for over 2 years in the lead up to the final disaster. It really brought people together in a way that I don't think we'd have reached them in any other way, actually, if it wasn't for Cheltenham for Europe. So it benefited twinning.
Indeed, yeah. I think a lot of us probably took European connections and everything else about Europe for granted for rather too long, and suddenly we found that a lot of it was being taken away. Roland, you wanted to...
Just to follow up on that, I mean, we were sort of on the point of the early stages of developing some kind of local campaign on the back of Brexit to say, missing your friends in Europe sort of thing. Here's something you can, trying to use it as a recruitment tool for new twinning members. So, and that was again scuppered by subsequent developments. So I just wondered whether anyone else had any experience or thoughts about trying to, use that situation as a way of, very positively promoting twinning as a way of staying in touch with Europe.
It was something that we looked into. and we hoped that we would get forward with in the sort of March, April, May time, and that groups such as this group of European Hampshire for EU could mention to anybody that's interested to reach out to their local twinning associations, and maybe they could put people in contact with us and get things moving that way as well. You know, it needs a lot more than just twinning associations reaching out. It needs people like Hands for EU to tell people that twinning associations exist and could be a way that people can get that European bit under their belt, or whatever you want to call it. You know, people working together to promote and get things going is sort of what we're looking for. It's why I joined this meeting, to see if that was the sort of thing you were looking at doing.
I think it's certainly the sort of thing that can be done. Like all things, it kind of needs people with the enthusiasm to sort of make an initiative on that sort of thing and to try and take it forward. It has to be said, the email went out to about 850 people about this event, and the attendance has been great from the people who are here, but you know, it could have been more widespread, and I think that's suggesting either that people don't really know what twinning is, or just don't really identify with it. And maybe, as people are saying, you know, classic twinning is a thing, but maybe what we're looking at is different ways forward, different models.
Well, we don't do the classic twinning thing very much at all anymore, because it just doesn't exist. It can't do. People are too busy. They don't want to do the old fortnight in foreign people's homes and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So you've got to look at modernising. But if people don't know what twinning is, it's not just about twinning associations telling them what it is. It's about groups such as yourself explaining what twinning is and saying it's a route into getting friends in Europe, surely.
Indeed. And, you know, we welcome input from particularly people like you, Andrew, to provide that message, which we can then distribute, because we don't know enough about it to actually do that by ourselves, but we can certainly provide a channel and some focus on that. I was wondering, but Paul or Andy Adams, whether you wanted to come in on anything, or if you're quite happy sitting quietly in the background on this. It's unlike you to be quiet for so long, Paul.
It is, I know. No, I've really enjoyed it. I wanted to know how you, William, and Bryony got together. Are you the leading expert in the UK on twinning, Bryony?
No, I got Bryony's contacts from another academic at the University of Southampton, who was going to be part of the panel when we were talking about doing this live earlier in the year. He's unfortunately no longer able to participate, but he recommended Bryony as somebody who has an interest in this area, and you know, we're very grateful that she was able to participate and give us her insight.
Yeah. I've told Bryony privately, but I'm an ABBA alumnus myself, and I shall be in Machantworth, where you live. Is that what you said? Gosh, in about a month's time. So, and I think there are lots of other networks apart from traditional twinning organisations that we can reach out to. Eleanor and I, for instance, are involved in something called Mayors for Peace, which links with Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. That's moving forward, Eleanor. I've been in touch with Debbie. And you know, there are those networks, and there are groups all over Europe, you know, mayors who are working on a sort of anti-war forum. You know, there are just loads and loads of different networks that we've just got to get into. And I just wondered, most of the twinning experiences we've heard are France and Germany. I think we heard Spain as well. But, you know, given that there are 27 or whatever it is, European countries now, I just wonder whether anybody's got any experience of reaching out beyond the sort of traditional countries.
Ours are not in the EU. Now, we have many sister cities and things which are technically twin cities, but not within an official signed charter of cooperation, which is what the twin city, what do you call it, label comes from. But ours are in the United States and in Israel and Japan and China and Australia. We're looking to Canada for a new one, and the Falkland Islands. There was talk of Italy and Sweden, so maybe they'll come forward. It all depends on what the current council and the councillors are thinking and what they want to do. But our ones are France and Germany. They're the long-standing twin cities. I also do promotion of all the other links, but I'm only the chair of the Twinning Association. I just give information as to where the people can get to find out about the other things from. But I do act for the Japan and American ones, as no one else does.
Great, thanks, Andrew. And all these links presumably will be on the site, will they, William? So we can.
If people want to add any links into the chat, then that's a way of sharing them. I can always publish the chat list afterwards, perhaps.
Somebody mentioned just now that 27, members of the EU. Twinning predates, in a sense, the EU. I mean, I think there have been twinning associations since '45. Perhaps not officially, but they've certainly
back to the 1930s, actually.
Well, okay, well that's wonderful. But I was in Annecy in '68, and the Maison des Jeunes, for example, which were like youth activity centres, they had a very strong. They set their link up in '45 with Germany. It was very, very strongly post-war Franco-German cooperation, and that's where that started. But twinning now could and should be worldwide. You'll always, I think, perhaps have that emphasis in Franco-German because they keep it going. But it isn't a specifically European thing. It can be much wider. And it's very interesting to hear when people have links with much more, well, say unusual places, but places elsewhere, further flung around the world. And that's very interesting and perhaps more interesting for young people.
Yeah, one of the things I was reading when I was looking into the history of it as well was that after 1945, a lot of German towns were very keen to reach out and to initiate those kind of relationships to create a break from the past. But those would presumably have been much younger people then who are nevertheless probably no longer around now. But, Andy, did you have anything you wanted to?
I was at a conference in Brussels in 2008, and I was really impressed by what the EU were doing to promote twinning across the whole of the, not just the EU band of nations, but the surrounding nations that are not members of the EU, which can also participate in programs with EU members. And a big feature of that was the whole nation of remembrance, really, of the utter savagery that had haunted Europe for not just the past century, but for centuries before, and that communities were coming together to run joint projects that brought them together in a way that had never been done before. And I agree totally. Yes, it's a big world out there. There's 220 odd countries in the world that we could all go off and twin with Tuvalu. And a colleague of mine did a youth exchange with Tuvalu, this little island in the Pacific, about 10 years ago. I mean, we could all find places like that, but we've got to think practicalities. And, and there's a rich European history, regardless of the politics of the EU, that we can engage with. I've been trying for the last 10 plus years to try and get Cheltenham Borough Council to consider taking on a twin town in the former Eastern Bloc. And they keep saying, well, it would cost too much money. We don't, we've got 5 as it is, that's enough. And I just don't think that's good enough in a world that's changing so quickly. But I'm banging my head against a brick wall at the moment, I'm afraid.
Okay, sorry, Andy, we kept losing you there.
Oh, well, nothing particularly Pearl's wisdom to add. I'll pass on to William some apologies from Tim Fell come through in the email, making a passionate case for Cordoba in Spain as a marvelous potential twin for Winchester. So you can read that at your leisure. I know it's very interesting. One thing I do wonder, having talked with the visits and all that, is what can we do to raise awareness of the twinned towns that are there and the relationships that are there on a day-to-day level. And I still remember being at a pub quiz in Reading years ago when I lived there, and the tie break at the end of the quiz was, what towns are Reading twinned with? And a lot of us drove past the road signs every single day and they were up there. Could we get all 6 answers or whatever it was? And some places like Basingstoke have roads named after them. What can we do to get more just in the general consciousness of where we do have twinning, above and beyond those who will be actively involved and consider visits or those sorts of things? What can we do just to see a general awareness? And you know, even local press every now and again, what can we think about, or what has worked well to just get the general visibility of the good stuff that is going on, and then try to build on it a bit more. And again, being a bigger place, I've been involved for years with Reading Pride, and we ended up doing quite well in building links with our sister Pride in Reading, Pennsylvania. And there's something to be said for places that in the English-speaking world with the same name. I mean, virtually everything's been copied in America. And at least once, usually multiple times, and in some places that have had reasonable success in building links with towns of the same name in the States or English-speaking world. So I guess we just have to keep the boundaries as open as they can be.
Thanks for that. I'm conscious that people are drifting away now, so we'll perhaps sort of move towards the end. I don't know whether Martin Todd is still there or just a cardboard cutout by now. Oh, he's still there. Do you have
still here.
Observations as we sort of wrap things up?
Well, I found it very thought-provoking. I think it's highlighted that, you know, I think what it's told me is that we do need to be careful not to treat that there are 2 projects, shall we say, and twinning is something about a kind of depth of relationship that people have talked about, which is potentially very powerful. But there is still, I think, this project which relates back to the European movement to say, how do we turn people in other countries into people and not dehumanize them, and how do we make that happen? And it's clear that that's not going to be straightforward. I think what's clear also is that maybe when we're thinking about that, we need a multi-dimensional approach. So twinning is a tool, but it's not the only tool. And we need to be mindful of where new methods are developing. And we need to also be careful that we don't just see official twinning as the only thing that matters when schools are doing other things. That's also twinning, it's just not structured the same way and on some levels. And I was also impressed by what people were saying about the breadth of twinning when it was really working, when it sort of became a project that started to intersect with pride or other activities that were going on. So I think there's a lot, and I suppose the last point, and I would, you know, as a county councillor and as a city councillor, that comes across is it really helps if the local authority finds a way to get behind it. And one of the things that we're thinking about and struggling with, and actually ties into one of the discussion points that was made earlier, which is potentially we're about to have a lot of people with no right to vote living in our area from all over Europe who are part of our community without a formal way of expressing their voice. And the challenge that was talked about where people weren't taking part in twinning, well, maybe we need to be thinking about this sort of as a wider project, because I think there's a lot of challenges coming up that we're going to need to work out. And but I would hope that twinning can remain part of that for a long time to come. So not much of a thought, but that's sort of
good.
Yeah.
When we write our community strategy, I will make the commitment that twinning will be in there.
Thanks. Bryony, do you have any sort of concluding thoughts on that before we wrap up?
I still don't have the winning nugget, but this has been a fascinating conversation, and I've very much appreciated hearing from everybody. One thing, there was a question about how many academics are doing this. There are, to my knowledge, there are four of us. I'm not, this is not my area at all. I'm a rural and regional development expert in my day job, and I sort of fell into this. But one thing that I would observe is the research that I've done on twinning is, of all the research that I've ever done, the research that people are most interested in and fascinated by. Whenever I go to conferences, when I go to, I'm involved in the Wales Institute of Social and Economic Research. We have big conferences. I go to that and talk about twinning, and everyone says, tell us more about the twinning. I can talk about anything else, they don't care. They love twinning. So how do we sort of pick up on that momentum if people are actually interested in twinning? It's just if I then turn around to them and say, so will you join your local twinning association? They say, oh no. But I would leave it that it is a really interesting thing to me how interested people are to hear that I work on town twinning.
Well, thank you very much, Bryony, for travelling all the way, if only virtually, from Aberystwyth to join us in Hampshire, and as well as people like Martin, who've come from Cheltenham and various other places closer to hand. It's certainly been an interesting discussion, and perhaps people have made some new connections within this country, if not across borders. Please give a big round of applause to thank Bryony and everybody else for participating. And we'll wind it up there. And if anybody wants to be on our mailing list to be notified of future events, then the details of our website are in the chat. And hope to see more of you next time. And thank you all now. Goodbye.
Nosta.
Thanks, folks.
Bye.